All right, let's dive into this modern marketers thing from Google. I'm really interested to see what these CMOs and folks are saying about
Yeah,
all this stuff we deal with every day.
absolutely. And it's a great lineup too. You've got leaders from Uber and HubSpot, Colgate Palmolive, even Experian. And, they're all tackling this evolving marketing landscape. So
Right.
I think there are some really valuable insights here for us.
Yeah, I think one of the things that jumped out at me is just this whole you know ROI conversation. And I know we talk about this all the time, but
Hmm.
Jim Lisinski, the professor from Kellogg, he made this point that really stuck with me. But it's not enough to just report on these
Vanity metric.
yeah,
Yeah.
vanity
Yeah.
metrics.
Yeah, it's got to be about the bottom line.
It's about the bottom line.
How is marketing actually contributing to revenue growth, market share, all of that?
Got to be measurable, right?
Absolutely. And you got to be able to, walk into that C-suite, especially the CFO's office with that hard data.
Yeah, and I think that's it really speaks to this whole data-driven decision-making thing. It's like how do we prove that alignment between marketing goals and business objectives?
Right.
And how do we do it with,
Real numbers.
real numbers,
Yeah.
not just, likes and shares,
Exactly.
which, they have their place, but they don't tell the whole story.
They don't pay the bills.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And speaking of, going beyond those surface level metrics, Daisy E from Experian, she shared this really interesting example
Oh, yeah.
about, how they discovered that a lot of their customers actually preferred interacting through their app.
Okay, so they just kind of took that data and said, okay, let's just pump
Do-
more resources into the app.
Well, not exactly. They actually went a step further and asked why. Like, what was driving that preference? What were the underlying motivations there? So it's not just about what they're doing. It's about why.
Exactly. It's about understanding that why. So they could, actually tailor that app experience to better meet those customer needs.
It's about the story behind the data.
Okay.
What is this telling us about what our customers really value?
Mm-hmm.
And then how do we use that to, create a better experience and ultimately, drive business growth?
Right. Connect the dots
Connect the dots, yeah.
between those customer behaviors and your business outcomes.
Exactly.
And that actually, kind of leads into this other theme that came up a lot in these conversations, which is this whole idea of experimentation.
Right. Like that test and learn approach.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I know Appreciate King from Colgate Palmolive, she talked about that. And Evan Hanlon, the CEO of Choreograph, he was a big proponent of that as well. Like this whole idea that you got to be willing to
Embrace the experimentation.
embrace it, yeah.
Yeah.
Even if it means, failing sometimes.
Yeah, not being afraid of those failures, seeing them as opportunities to learn.
I think that's such a key point,
Yeah.
especially for, us as senior marketing leaders. Like we need to be creating that culture where it's okay to
Right.
experiment, to try new things,
Right.
and to, learn from those experiments, whether they succeed or fail.
Absolutely. And that takes, a certain level of psychological safety within the team and critically buy-in from leadership. They need to be willing to allocate the budget for that testing.
Yeah, totally.
And speaking of things that require budget, we can't not talk about AI. Everybody's talking about it.
Right. It's the hot topic
It is,
these days.
sure.
Yeah.
It's interesting to see how all these, leaders are approaching this whole AI thing. It's
Yeah.
easy to get, I think, swept up in all the hype. But Evan Hanlon, the CEO of Choreograph, I think he made a really good point about, AI is a tool. It's not like
It's
a
magic bullet.
magic bullet, right?
Okay.
It's not going to solve everything.
Yeah, it's not going to magically fix all of our marketing problems.
Right.
We still need to be, thinking strategically. We need to be creative.
Absolutely.
We need to understand our customers.
And Kip Bodnar from HubSpot, he actually had a really good example of how AI can be used effectively.
Mm-hmm.
He was talking about using it for, personalized marketing, but at scale. So like,
Yeah.
Crafting individual emails for every single customer.
Which would be a nightmare for a human.
It would be a nightmare for a human.
Yeah. So I guess it's interesting, right? Because it shows the potential of AI to really
Yeah.
streamline those processes
Yeah.
and free us up to focus on,
Mm-hmm.
the more strategic stuff.
Right.
But then it also raises these questions about, what's that balance between automation
Yeah.
and that human touch?
Right. Where's that line?
Yeah.
I think that's really the key, right? Like finding that sweet spot. AI can augment our capabilities, But it shouldn't, I don't think.
Yeah.
Completely replace, human intuition and creativity.
Yeah, we can't forget about building those genuine connections with our customers. Speaking of kind of connecting with customers in a genuine way, another thing that I thought was really interesting from these podcasts was this idea of balancing short-term impact with long-term brand building.
Yeah. And David Morgensen from Uber, he actually had a really great example of this. Their Super Bowl campaign, they managed to drive, immediate membership signups for Uber One, but also, reinforce that positive brand association.
Yeah, which lasts longer than just that initial. It's that long game.
Yeah. So, from your perspective, how do you, I know this is something that, we've all struggled with as marketers. Like, how do you strike that balance between those short-term wins that, the C-suite loves and those long-term brand building initiatives, which, they often take longer to show results?
Yeah, you need those quick wins, but you got to keep your eye on the prize.
I think it's about really understanding, what your brand's core values are, and then how those values translate into, tangible benefits for your customers.
So consistency.
Yeah.
Even across those different campaigns and initiatives.
Yeah, exactly. And recognizing that every interaction, every touch point is a chance to build that brand equity.
It's not just about those one-offs.
Right. It's that always-on approach.
Always on. I like that.
Always be marketing.
It speaks to that idea of, constantly engaging, nurturing those relationships.
Yeah, staying top of mind.
Staying top of mind.
Creating that that stream of valuable content and experiences.
And so it's almost like it's less about shouting from the rooftops, and it's more about building those, genuine, lasting connections. We've covered a lot here.
We have. We've talked about, proving ROI, understanding the why behind customer actions, embracing experimentation, finding that sweet spot with AI, and then, balancing those short-term wins with the
long-term brand building. Right. So for our listener who's, already deep in this world, what's that one thing they should be thinking about as they continue to shape their strategies?
Adaptability, I think that's the biggest thing, Things are constantly changing, new technologies, new trends. What worked yesterday might not work tomorrow,
So staying agile.
Yeah.
Being open to trying new things.
Exactly. And never stop learning. Always be curious.
Yeah, have that growth mindset.
Yeah, for yourself, for your team. Always challenging those assumptions. Testing.
Yeah, and I think it all comes back to really understanding the customer.
The customer. Always knowing their needs, meeting them where they are. At the end of the day, it's all about building those relationships. And relationships are built on trust. They're built on value, and they're built on really knowing your audience.
Yeah, so true. Well, hopefully this deep dive has given everyone some food for thought as they navigate this crazy world of marketing.
Absolutely. Stay curious out there and keep that customer at the heart of everything you do.
Until next time, happy marketing, everyone.